This is Blake Smith, Project Manager for Project Zion Podcast. This episode of Say What is part one of a conversation between hosts Kassie Ripsam and Marianne Bennett-Ripsam and their guests Paul Bethel and Laurie Gordon. It's part of a larger series of episodes in which Kassie and Marianne interview the authors of the proposed legislation for the 2025 World Conference. Again, this is part one of a two-part conversation regarding G-5, Climate Emergency Fossil Fuel Reduction, submitted by the Greater Pacific Northwest Mission Center.
Hello, and welcome to Project Zion Podcast. I'm Kassie.
And I'm Marianne.
And today we're interviewing Miss Laurie G. and Mr. Paul Bethel about the G5 resolution. And first we have a few getting to know you questions. And once again, thank you for being here.
So, yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
Do you guys think you would survive a zombie apocalypse?
No. I prefer to think I'll sacrifice myself to make room for somebody younger that has a chance.
Interesting answer. Ms. Laurie?
Well, so what I really want to say is, I want to ask the question, am I going to survive the current zombie apocalypse? Because we're living in a time that feels apocalyptic in the traditional sense, but apocalypse actually means revelation. I'm going to nerd out a little bit here. It means seeing the revealing of hidden patterns. And we're seeing that a lot, and we're seeing that a lot with, just this place of living as if we're dead, as if we're not awake. And so here we are in this place where being awake, which is something we've been asked to do, to really look and see the world and be willing to gaze at suffering and injustice, is more of a political weapon than it is a spiritual imperative, and on both sides. So for all of us to be called to that deeper looking and gazing and being alive in the world, I don't know that I would survive it. But like with Paul, the question for me more is, until something happens, can I contribute something that will make it possible for your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to inherit a beautiful earth that we've managed to enjoy? So I don't know.
So what part of a driver's test do you think you would most likely fail or do poorly in?
Gotta think about that.
Well, yesterday, I'll just give Paul an extra moment. Yesterday, I came out of an interfaith earth care gathering and didn't realize that what had melted had frozen quickly. So I'm from California, but I live in a snowy area in Central Oregon, and I never got to do the wheelies in the parking lot, with someone teaching me. So my car actually did a little fishtailing and
Little fishtail.
Yeah. And I guess the good news was I didn't overreact. I just kind of let it correct itself. But if you took me and made me do that part of driving, I'd have a hard time.
Yeah, our driveway is actually made of sand. And so it has I don't know what to call them. They're like water redirectors, I guess. They're like little hills that redirects the water when it rains. So sometimes we'll do a little bit of a fishtail, but thankfully Mommy did get to do they're called donuts. And so she's actually pretty good at that one, but it always scares me when we do the little fishtail thing.
We do live in Florida, but our parents are from Michigan, and a couple of weeks ago, I don't know, I lose track of times sometimes. Anyway, my point is we got 8 inches of snow, and we're
A little bit of ice.
a little bit.
Well, it melted and then kind of refroze. So yeah.
Yeah, so they might have been able to drive, but we're a little bit scared to get out on the road.
How about you, Paul? Mr. Paul?
Yeah, well, I took driver's ed in high school, and I was in the Midwest, so we actually did go to a large parking lot, and they taught us how to do donuts and how to recover from spins and things. It was a lot of
Did I
fun.
taught you that? Yeah. That's
Yeah, that's back when it was a high school class. I guess insurance made that impractical. But probably now the worst thing I would do is I would have a problem with backing up because I can't get used to looking at the rear view camera doodad thing that all your new cars have. I can't. And I learned how to twist around and look back, put your arm, and I don't have the flexibility to do that anymore. So I try to go straight forward as much as possible and avoid having to back up. So if there was part of that on a test, I would probably do poorly, or else I'd cripple myself trying to back up.
Do you guys ever talk to inanimate objects?
Like yelling at your phone, your computer, or
Well, yeah, I was going to
being
say,
polite.
I swear at my computer. I do talk to rocks, but I consider them animate, just slower than us. So rocks and rivers and things like that. But yeah, anything that's technologically based, I swear at. When I get the artificial so-called intelligence answer, I don't talk to that because I want to talk to a real person. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I tell myself often, my computer is my friend. If you say it often enough, it becomes so. But I don't really talk to inanimate objects. I do talk to my dogs a lot, especially when I'm walking them and they just get it in their head that they need an inordinate amount of time to sniff a particular shrub, and I'm wanting to move on. So we have some philosophical discussions from time to time on the importance of any particular shrub. That would be it.
Although I am pretty sure that a lot of us were yelling at our TVs last night with the Super Bowl. So there is that.
I personally have a thing with trying to convince some objects to work the way that I want them to. And
even though they're doing exactly what they think that you told them to do, they cannot do anything else.
And there are some pets that I talk to that I personally feel like it makes more sense to talk to some of them over others. Like, I'll talk to my cat, and that makes some sense. But if I try to talk to the chickens or the lizards, then they're probably not going to respond to me nearly as well.
They have less facial expression.
well, maybe it's a matter of learning their language.
Well, yeah, that too.
So I figured that, when I talk to trees, it's like I want to learn that language so I can really communicate. Hear what they have to tell me.
I hear a blade. I swear that the chicken who's been stuck inside is responding to us better, or maybe I'm just hearing him better. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we're going off on bunny trails. Okay. What is the weirdest dream you've ever had?
Well, I can tell you a dream I had decades ago that I still remember pretty vividly. I had this dream of this big fireball coming down this valley and destroying and melting everything, and it really scared me at the time. But what happened after the destruction went through was everything had been reformed and reshaped, and it was so much more beautiful. It had, cars had melted and turned into tables, and I was living in this crystal house with a crystal banquet table, and somebody came and knocked at the door, and the person at the door was one of the people was the most difficult for me in my life, and I was so happy to see him and welcomed him. And it's been kind of an iconic dream for me my whole life, that sense of, things that scare us turning out to be something that holds promise for a better way of living. And so in this time of climate crisis, it still feels appropriate to think of things that are changing, but things that need to be transformed and made new. So that's kind of my...
Yeah.
So it's a dream that was scary when I first had it and holds promise for me now that I've lived into it for multiple decades.
Those things, they can be really, really different looking back on them than when you first saw them or first dreamt them. It's really beautiful sometimes.
And honestly, I'll say that although definitely not every dream holds some kind of meaning, there are definitely those that do.
I can't think of any mind-boggling or earth-shattering dreams that I've had.
Well, it can be a weird one, unless you just are one of those people who don't remember dreams.
I just don't remember. I've woken up and remembered some dreams that either terrified me or concerned me, but after a day or two, I can't remember what it was or what it was about.
I've had plenty of dreams like that.
So, where did y'all grow up?
I grew up in the Livermore Valley in California. And my granddad had a cattle ranch, so I got to spend part of my time just being out riding horses and looking at wildflowers and learning about loving the earth from being on the ranch and then hiking in the parks around there. So I love that. Love it. I love the landscape. I love the trees. I love everything about it. But I don't live there anymore. I live in Oregon and I now love it here.
Man, I love riding horses. And oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So I grew up all over. I was born in Iowa, but I grew up my kindergarten through about 6th grade. I was in Japan. My dad was a missionary. From there, my junior high time was in East Lansing, Michigan, because my dad was assigned as a campus minister at Michigan State University. And then my high school was in Lamoni, and my dad was at Graceland, teaching at Graceland College. So those are the three, through my high school years, 3 places that I grew up in.
I've literally never been out of the country. We had an opportunity to with a choir, but like it was so expensive and we'd hardly be doing anything. So
yeah. We travel a lot and have gotten to do a lot of things. As Marianne mentioned, we have gotten the opportunity to ride horses and to climb mountains and stuff like that, but we have never made it out of the country. Of course, inside the country, there are some things to see. More than just some things. There are a lot of things to see.
Completely different biomes from one side of the country to the next. So, Laurie, you were a research biologist.
I was.
How did that help you? How did that help you contribute to this resolution?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, the easy answer is just it makes me less afraid of the science. It makes it easy for me to look at graphs and understand it at a more of a gut level what's going on. But what I did, I helped with the mapping and annotation of chromosome 19 for the Human Genome Project. And when we had the first sequence, we also looked at the analogous region in chickens and ended up doing a study where I basically got to look at evolution in the genome. Like here's the same stretch of DNA, but here's how it's broken and rearranged in the other creature. And so we kind of looked at humans and apes, the very little difference, dogs, a little more difference, mice, a little more difference, but still you could trace it all the way down through frog sequence to see how we were related and how things had evolved and changed over time. So it's like really being able to look at this fundamental truth that drives my passion around climate change and ecological issues, which is just how related we all are. You know, like if you can trace the family tree back far enough, we're all cousins. And we live together in ecosystems. And so my sense of how beautiful and how fragile the web of life, the tree of life is, led to my real interest in biodiversity loss, because it doesn't make sense to me if you think God is in and through all things, that getting rid of kin that are that are our family, that are the place where there's the presence of the holy in the world, it doesn't make sense to me to be destroying it. And biodiversity loss turned into just a recognition that climate is the quintessential threat to the tree of life. So there is a way in which both the science and the spirituality part of my background came together and said, people in faith communities are the ones who need to be at the forefront of addressing this issue of destroying the way life was created to exist on this planet. So
I just want to pitch in that being on the climate justice team with Laurie, she has forced me to really develop that idea of kinship, that to not be so human centric, and the idea that God loves everything that God created. God created everything, therefore everything is sacred. Which to me makes more sense when you say sacredness of creation. You can't really say that and still be human centric. And so if we're going to have that as a catchphrase, then we have to acknowledge all life that was created. And I've learned that from Laurie, grudgingly, I admit, but it's expanded my thinking. And I didn't mean to intrude on Laurie's
No,
time,
yeah, that's fine.
What I think is interesting is you look at the story of creation in the Bible, and I'm in high school right now, and I have to take history and science and all that, and it doesn't exactly, and at first I didn't think it lined up with the story of the creation, and I didn't want to accept it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized with how little we know in a scientific point of view about the way the earth was created, and I think about that, well, doesn't that mean that it lines up more than I think? And I was able to put two and two together and realize, well, science and spirituality can coexist. The more I sat and thought about that, the more I just thought, well, isn't that interesting?
yeah, the weaving of creation is a story that's told in many different ways, and there's truth in all of them. My experience as a research biologist was to really recognize and be able to participate in it. And my experience of it is not so much one of limiting my faith, but actually expanding my faith. It kind of takes some of the limits off of who I think or who I was taught God ought to be, and kind of opens up the possibilities for this presence that's creative and still creating and weaving creation together. Even today, even while we're working on pulling it apart, creation herself is continuing to create new possibilities. And that's a place that gives me hope and deepens my faith. So, yeah.
Paul, what are some of the things that you have learned by sitting in on efforts by other faith traditions?
I think the biggest thing is it's convinced me that climate change is a faith thing. It's a church thing. A lot of people, we hear a lot of people saying that this is political, we shouldn't be involved. This isn't appropriate for church. But, people like the United Church of Christ, Jim Antal, Margaret Bullock-Jonas, she's an Episcopal priest. They preach climate from the pulpit. They mix in the sacredness of creation as well as our directive to steward creation. And the idea that climate change is causing human suffering and it's going to become worse and worse. And if that isn't a church thing to alleviate human suffering, I don't know what is. It was through one of those two that there's a guy named Gus Speth who was a lawyer, and he said, he used to think that environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And he said, after, good science, 25, 30 years, we could fix this. But he says, I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And lawyers and scientists don't know how to change that. What we need is a spiritual and cultural transformation. And who's going to do that if not the church? So that's what I learned from them.
But people don't realize, saying that politics shouldn't be a church conversation, is that Jesus had politically heated conversations. Well, not really politically heated, but he had conversations that involved politics with his disciples. The Good Samaritan. The Samaritans were not very liked by the community that he was in when he was talking about this. So the fact that he was portraying the Samaritan as the good guy in this kind of conversation was political and kind of wouldn't be perceived well by a lot of people.
It's often a loss in not only church, but sometimes in our home environments to avoid conversations that sound political. Even if it's not just political, if it goes beyond politics, sometimes it's still avoided because it makes people uncomfortable, because it's associated with what you hear in the news. And that's kind of a loss to just avoid those conversations because they need to be talked about and they need to be resolved.
Climate change being a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, really good example of that. But one thing, just the conversation we had earlier about learning to speak the other language, with our dogs or with the trees, there's a way in which trying to learn how to speak the language across our political divides is an urgent task. And avoiding is not going to help us learn the language that allows us to communicate what's really on our hearts. And there are some pretty thorny, difficult issues, but that's not what the topic of the podcast is. But I also want to say about Paul is that having been with Paul on this climate team, I have learned so much from him about really taking to heart and finding courage to speak truth, as you're talking about, to speak truth across the political divides, to speak truth about justice and how that is not a separate issue from climate, but is an interwoven issue that as we look at all the effects of climate with migration and the way in which those who have been less privileged are the ones who've borne the brunt of it. And if you want a spokesperson for that, Paul is your guy.
So, Laurie,
yes,
you mentioned having studied Christian mystics. What are Christian mystics?
So this is a dangerous topic to let me loose on, so I'll try to keep it brief. The Christian mystics are those who take seriously the encounter with a living presence, with the living God. So through time, they are those who have devoted themselves to a contemplative path that is not made complete unless it moves into that place of service and action to the rest of the world. Christian mysticism is about being embodied. It's about, I would think of Jesus as a mystic, one whose prayer and allowing the truth of what it was to be fully human to take root and be poured out in service of the poor and mistreated and socially marginalized and oppressed is completely breathtaking. So thinking about your zombie question, the mystics are the ones who call us to wake up, to see a bigger picture, to recognize the pattern and the presence of spirit in and through all things. And so I could give you a ton of examples. One of the most famous is probably St. Francis of Assisi. He chose not to have possessions. And when he was challenged and said, oh, you should have possessions, he said, why would I want to own anything? Then I would just have to take up weapons to defend it. So he eschewed violence by saying, I don't need to consume so much. That's really relevant to climate action, right? Yeah. And he felt and saw himself immersed in, with earth, air, fire, and water. Brother, the turtle you saw on the road, he would have taken the effort to sidestep and make sure that he moved that turtle to safety. We know he did that with worms. So they lived these lives that showed us what's really possible to be human. And there are mystics from that show us that instead of being half awake or fully asleep, or giving in to the worst of our potential, our egos, the mystics are the ones who really actively went in and said, how do I cultivate humility? How do I cultivate an attitude that says, I'm not better than you, but I'm also important and my gifts really matter. And at the heart of that is the recognition that the divine is in all of us. And whether we see it or not. And so they just provide this way of bringing prayer and attention to God into the action and service that they offer to the world. And I could go on, but I'll stop there.
I do not know how to respond to that, except to assure you,
cool.
Except to assure you, Miss Laurie, that the baby turtle does have a home now.
Oh, but it does. I can tell. Because we're all mystics at heart. When we let the light that's inside of us be what guides our actions, the baby turtles are going to find a safe home. And so you are a mystic too. You just didn't know it. I really do believe that when we honor the truth of God in our hearts, we're dipping our toes in the water of how we want to act in the world.
It's really cool, and I think that's honestly really powerful. So, Mr. Paul, you said that our faith tradition looked disengaged on the subject of climate change. What are some of the ways you've seen evidence of that?
I don't want my church to be irrelevant. I think climate change is causing human suffering, and it's going to cause human suffering of biblical proportions. Probably within my lifetime, for sure within your lifetimes. And I don't want my church to be stuck in the thoughts and prayers category. I think that we should be leading. And even a small church like ours, if we are of one heart and one mind, we can move the needle. If 20 or 30, especially in this country, if 20 or 30,000 church members were to call their congressperson or their senator and said, look, this is what I want you to vote for, it makes a difference. So few people call that if we could even marshal a small percentage of our membership to become activated and to push for some things that we need to have happen, we could make a difference.
Yeah. Honestly, I do agree with the fact that just the small percentage can really make a difference. And like bringing this to a giant group of people like a world conference really does make a huge difference, even especially.
And personally, I think although it is great to have climate change in prayers, there's so much more we could do than just that. We can do something in our daily lives for that too.
See, spoken like a true mystic.
So to get into the more business questions, could you tell our listeners about the effects of climate change?
Like how could it affect us specifically?
Us and all the other people in our church.
Well, yeah, just like us two specifically.
What I think, in my opinion, the greatest threat right now is the overheating of the planet. And there's so many facets to the environment, but I think it's the overheating that we have to get a handle on no matter what. So we don't have the time to manifest, or to share all the ways that this fever of our planet manifests in our lives. But I think the really easy way to say is just the increased number of severe climate events that we're experiencing now, and they will get worse and worse. They've steadily been climbing over the last, in your lifetimes. Hurricane Helene and Milton is estimated to have cost $100 billion in damage. Some estimates are as high as $250 billion. The fires out here in Los Angeles, just in the last month, are estimated. AccuWeather says it's going to be $250 billion in damages. But $250 billion, that's more than the annual budget of like 80 countries in the world. Countries. So that's more than they spend in an entire year of a functioning government. 500 billion, combine those two events, or those three, 500 billion is the annual budget of Canada. So we can absorb these hits because we're rich and we've gathered all the resources from around the world. But these same climate disasters, they are happening all over the world. And what happens in these smaller countries whose annual budget is $1 billion, and they have a $100 billion climate event? They either die or they leave. And we're insulated. We don't realize that, but it's coming. We can't keep absorbing these hits forever. And so, I think that makes climate change the most pressing social and theological problem of our time.
When you see these graphs, the change looks really small, like on the point something percentage. But people don't realize that these more fragile species, and even like especially even the weather events, are affected by these point something percentage marks.
Yeah, and to the point of what Mr. Paul was saying, I was looking at history lessons, and we got into some of the finances of more recent countries, and it labeled some countries as failed countries. And I'm just like, they're failed countries? We're how rich, and we're not giving them anything. And they're the failed country? No. We're in a disaster zone right now. It's sad.
It's sad and it's dangerous. If it goes unchecked, there are already parts of let's broaden it beyond the United States. There are parts of India that get so hot in the summer now you can't work to make a living because it's too hot to function. Pakistan a couple years ago, I think it was 30% of the country was inundated with floods. Thousands of people died. There was a huge bushfire in Australia And these heat domes that we get off of the coast here, the West Coast, that kill billions of sea creatures, because our oceans are also overheating. And we'd already be beyond habitable if we didn't have the oceans absorbing the equivalent of, I can't remember the statistics of how many billions worth of Hiroshima level bombs that have been, that much heat has been absorbed in the oceans. And so we already have people fleeing. We think the immigration crisis and climate crisis are two separate things. We have people who cannot feed their families because of droughts in South America and in Africa. And we have big multinational corporations going in. We've encountered stories, people in the church even, who live in these areas where they're trying to protect their streams and waters, but big multinational corporations are coming in and polluting. So yeah, I like your question of what constitutes a failed state, and one of our favorite spokespeople around climate change is Katharine Hayhoe, and what she says is, what is climate change other than a failure to love? She looks at the biblical injunctions to take care of each other, take care of the poor, and realized that that's how she wanted to spend her life, was doing climate work, recognizing climate change is nothing more than a failure to love. So getting back to Paul's point about faith communities and the role that we could be playing, to if we would wake up and see the larger picture, going back to your zombie question right at the beginning, to not stay asleep, to not be dead, but to really live and be willing to look and see how all of these justice issues are now fully intersectional and intertwined with climate issues. They're not different issues.
Yeah. In the resolution, you reference the verses Doctrine and Covenants 157 as well as 163:3b. How have these verses impacted your life and your desire to improve the environment for both of you?
I like the phraseology in 150 points, section 7, and that was so long ago. That was W. Wallace Smith, which is like a history for you. But the phrase, we've got to do this while there is yet day. It's just it's a phrase that means, you got to hurry up. And the other 163, challenging cultural, political and religious trends that are contrary to the reconciling and restoring purposes of God. The cultural and political and economic trends are to continue to exploit, continue to extract, continue to burn, all in the name of profits. And we need to be the religious trend that challenges those trends. And we need to do it quickly while there is yet day, because we're running out of time. The Paris Accords were 10 years ago, and everybody agreed. Like I think all but one or two countries signed the Paris Climate Accords, that we have to keep global temperature rise to 1.5, I think they phrased it well below 2.0, because they all recognized that at 2.0 there was going to be catastrophic events. And right now there's probably several hundred million climate refugees scattered around. We don't track that, but when that becomes a billion, life on this planet as we know it will be so vastly different that all of our lives will be impacted. And that's the while there is yet day. We need to act while there is yet day, before that number climbs to a billion. Because once we get there, the recovery is going to take way too long. We're talking generations and generations. That's what those two scriptures kind of highlight for me.
Yeah, I'll tell you that I was a senior in high school in 1972 at my first World Conference when Section 150 was brought to the church. So it's really close to home for me. You can do the math. But it's over 50 years ago. The church received the wisdom that said, these are portentous times. That's 1972. The earth is being destroyed by greed and extraction. And I think about the earth that I knew when I was your age and what I know now, and it's still beautiful, but I can have experienced the loss of species, the loss of stable climate. It used to be when I would drive north, my windshields would be splattered with insects. Already, I can drive north on I-5 in California up to Oregon, and you don't get that anymore because so many of the insects are already gone. And what I really want is a world in which the coming generations will be able to experience the kind of beauty that if we would have been able to respond 53 years ago, how different our world would be today. But back then, everybody thought we still had time. We don't think that anymore.
Some people still do.
Yes, unfortunately, there are some people who wish to go slower or don't even believe that we are in an emergency at all. But I guess that's why we're here talking.
And we have time to fix it, but we don't have time to wait to fix it.
So, what are some things that both of you want to see done on a church level to reduce fossil fuel use?
I'd like to see us declare as a church the need to first stop the growth of fossil fuel expansion. We're burning more oil and gas today than we were 10 years ago when we realized it was a problem. We are burning more gas and oil today than we were when we declared a climate emergency at our last World Conference. And then as a group, declare our support for renewable energy. And then I would like to see us be on the edge. So when we get to supporting a ban on plastics, I want us to be in a position to say, yes, we want in on that. We support that. There's just so many different things that are going on. I don't want to be the last ones that sign on. I want to be closer to the front.
Yeah, I want us to really come to be signal communities that show what's possible if we take seriously the sacredness of the very land on which our buildings and campgrounds are cited as being fully sacred. What would it be like if we turned our campgrounds into places that are trying to be run in a way that is sustainable for the earth, as a way that we're a place where people could come and learn about that, where people could come and say, oh, this is what's possible. What if we were to put solar panels on our churches? What if we were to put heat pumps in? What if we were to say, let's let the lawn, or at least part of the lawn, go back to and be wild? What if we were, said, let's let's tend the old growth trees that we have and plant new trees. How to be at the forefront of those who would keep this needless destruction from happening. And I think there's a lot of people, particularly folks, younger folks who are coming up, who are seeing and living with their lives being severely impacted by climate issues. Let's be relational. Let's part of it is just loving each other so that we're better at loving the world, and vice versa. So I think that there's a lot of things we could do. We could do community gardens. We can take out our lawns and plant native plants and pollinators. We can show the world what's possible, if we really caught on. But the first thing is going to be maybe a congregation just needs a green team so that they can learn about this and figure out what to do next and take the next step instead of dreaming so big. They just need to say, oh, our next step is going to be composting the waste from potluck. Let's take the first step, but then let's keep taking steps together.
Yeah. And like something that I would like to see done just starting to practice green stuff would probably be like maybe even, I don't know, starting getting a beehive and like starting doing that. Because not only is that putting pollinators in your area, it's you get honey out of it too. So like there's really cool stuff from that. And like if you ask, someone's probably going to be willing to do it, to take care of them.
My younger sister is really into this stuff, and in our old congregation, she had us replant the garden, and she had us put up a bat home. She really insisted that we had to help any of the wildlife that may be living in the more city area that our congregation was in, and we were surprised that there actually was wildlife.
Yeah. And also, what would it be like to be more responsive to how climate's impacting everyone around the church and not just those of us in North America? What if we really took to heart being a world church?
I think that is a bit of a more struggling question, because there are people who are reaching out, but there are some people who aren't able to go and find people outside of their area. And there are people who are trying to find ways to be a world church right where they are. So it's a complicated question to try and answer, because it's a layered one. That
onion.
Yeah, it's a bit of an onion of a question.
You've been listening to part one of a two-part conversation regarding 2025 World Conference Resolution G-5, Climate Emergency, Fossil Fuel Reduction. Be sure and watch for part two of this very important and engaging conversation coming soon to Project Zion.